and many others. We conducted a large number of interviews of participants belonging to all political streams, Gandhians, socialists, communists, what have you, from top leaders like Ravi Narayan Reddy, V. Rao, Arutla Ramchandra Reddy, who accompanied us on this tour in this area, to village-level Dalam members, including many brave women fighters. This gave us the opportunity to get to know the wonderful people of this state, enjoy their generous hospitality, partake of their delicious cuisine, and record their saga of struggle and sacrifice and heroism. Since then, we have felt a special affinity with this land and its people. And therefore, we welcome this opportunity to renew our acquaintance with it. The Indian History Congress, as you know, is the largest and the oldest organization in the country of professional historians and has played a crucial role and has a crucial role to play at this important turning point in the life of our nation. We are all aware of the grave challenge faced by the secular democratic edifice built in independent India on the foundations laid deep by our epic struggle for freedom. The cherished values of equity, equality, justice, secularism, humanism, democracy, and civil liberties, and much else, embodied in the Constitution are being questioned by those who never had any faith in them in the first place or any role in their evolution. And aggressive and regressive, hate-filled, hegemonic nationalism is being imported and substituted for our own homegrown, indigenous, humane, non-homogenizing progressive nationalism, bequeathed to us by Dadabhai Naoroji, Sarojini Naidu, Bipin Chandra Pal, who by the way coined the term of composite nationalism, Rajaji, Mahatma Gandhi, Maulana Azad, Jawaharlal Nehru, and many others. And in the process, what we see is a misuse of history, where a certain imagined and fanciful and often distorted and biased version of history is used to justify what are essentially contemporary political and political projects. This Congress, therefore, faces the difficult task of giving leadership to and providing a platform for resistance to these attempts. Indian historians have no choice but to stand up to what is in essence an assault on the very discipline of history. With these words, I would like once again thank the organizers of the Congress, the Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, the Local Secretary, the Secretary of the Indian History Congress, for giving me this honor and opportunity to be a part of this historic occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, for your address as the chief guest. Incidentally, if our members remember, after a long time, we had an academic as the chief guest instead of a politician. So I think that is something good that the Vice Chancellor himself decided to invite Madam here, and I am really thankful to him that instead of politicians, we have an academic between us. But we are hoping that on the last day, we might have the Deputy Chief Minister of Telangana. He, I am told, is going to join us in a valedictory session. Now, let me invite Professor Aditya Mukherjee. We are really waiting to hear you, sir.
Vice Chancellor Professor T. Ramesh, distinguished members on the stage and in the audience, which include my friends and comrades like Professor Shanta Sinha. I'm thankful to the Executive Council of the Indian History Congress for electing me as the General President this year. I'm deeply honored to be presiding over this august body, the largest and most representative organization of historians in India, which was created during the heyday of the Indian national movement in the mid-1930s. In conformity with the values of the national liberation struggle, symbolized as the idea of India, the Indian History Congress has spearheaded the promotion of scientific, secular, and anti-imperialist history. As all of you are aware, the idea of India is deeply threatened today, and the discipline of history is being mauled beyond recognition and weaponized to destroy the idea of India by religious communal forces which not only did not participate in India's freedom struggle, but indeed collaborated with imperialism. It is perhaps appropriate that on his 60th death anniversary, I should focus my address on what we can learn from Jawaharlal Nehru. The title of my address is Jawaharlal Nehru in our past, present, and future. Nehru was among the foremost champions of the idea of India, as well as of a scientific and meaningful history. I believe much can be learned from him to explain our present and chart out a vision of the future. From every speech that you heard today, beginning with that of the Vice Chancellor, you will see presently how much we have actually appropriated from what Jawaharlal Nehru said about history and what one should do with the discipline of history. It is because of what Nehru stood for that he is demonized today, blatantly by communal forces. All kinds of lies, abuse are spread about him using the massive propaganda machinery of the communal forces. Nehru is blamed for all of India's problems. From the partition of the country, the Pakistan problem, the China problem, the crisis in Indian agriculture, the Kashmir issue, crisis in education system, the persistence of poverty, the growing religious polarization in recent years, amending the constitution to curb democracy, name any problem, you find they say Jawaharlal Nehru is responsible. Such is the hatred spread about him that one leader of the current ruling party went of saying have aimed his gun at Nehru. Apart from spreading, the effort also to erase his memory from the minds of the Indian people. The iconic Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, built on the premises he lived as the first Prime Minister of India by an All Prime Ministers Museum, which is museum, Council of Historic Research, not to be left behind in pushing the current regime's initiatives, recently put up a poster celebrating the 75th year of Indian independence, where the pictures of many fighters were put up, except Jawaharlal Nehru, and in his place, the picture of V, a person, as you know, who apologized to the British, promising total loyalty. Done by distorting history, and that is what the communal forces have done. As I am addressing a distinguished gathering of historians, I would like to begin a brief discussion on Nehru's own attitude to the discipline of history before moving on to a discussion on how it is wrought in India. I do so as I believe from the early 1930s provided a framework participated in his own that was in contrast to the colonial and communal framework. Some of the most distinguished scholars of the country, as I mentioned, adopted and developed decades later the Nehruvian framework. Even now, I believe much can be learned from him. While referring to Nehru's outstanding historical works and the discovery of India, all written from British jails in the 1930s and between 1930 and 1944, Professor Irfan Habib made a very simple, which will surprise many of you. He compared Nehru's writing to Gramsci's iconic prison notebooks. Professor Habib says, these prison works invite comparison in both quantity and quality with the kind of writing that Antonio Gramsci produced a communist prisoner in fascist Italy. There are true similarities in that both went to history to find answers in their minds as men of action. As Nehru himself said, I'm quoting him, because fate and circumstances placed me in a position to be an actor in the saga of India, my interest in history became not an academic interest in things of the past, but an intense personal interest. One has to go back to history to understand the present and try to understand what the future ought to be. Habib quoted Marx's famous statement, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, to argue that for a man of action like Nehru, history was not just a directionless descriptive narrative placed in a chronological order, but a resource from which one sought to understand the present in order to try and shape the future. Nehru urged historians to approach history in this manner. For example, just when India was emerging from the Holocaust-like situation caused by communal strife and the partition of the country on that basis, and the newly born Indian state was to embark on the path of building a secular, inclusive country, Nehru tells historians in December 1948 the following. He says, history shows us both the binding process and the disruptive process. Today, a little more obviously. And in any activity that we are indulging in, we have the choice of laying emphasis on the binding and constructive aspects or the other. While exhorting the historians to emphasize the former, in the printed version it is written as latter, please correct it, he wants, true to the rigors of the discipline of history, I'm quoting him, we must not, of course, give way to wishful thinking and emphasize something which we want to emphasize, which has no relation to fact. However, he goes on to say, nevertheless, I think it is possible within the terms of scholarship and precision and truth to emphasize the binding and constructive aspects rather than the other. And I hope the activities of historians will be directed to that end. I'll just take 30 seconds to tell you that there are three major errors in the printed version. One, I just now corrected, it is not latter but former on page 4, line 7. On page 13, last para, first line, there is an additional A which has to be removed. And on page 33, second para, line 9, the binary that I talk about is communal versus national, not secular versus national. So please correct those. To return to what I was saying, that is the emphasis to the emphasis on the binding and constructive aspect of history is what Nehru himself did brilliantly in his classic work, The Discovery of India. While the colonial and communal approach was to constantly try to weaponize any conflict in the past to exacerbate them in the present. The colonial communal interpretation, you may note that I use them simultaneously because there is a deep umbilical cord connection between the colonial and the communal. We must remind you of this because the communal now masquerades as the nationalist, but actually they have a deep colonial connection. The colonial communal interpretation repeatedly emphasized the trauma experienced as a result of Hindu-Muslim conflict. These theories, or rather memories, so-called memories of trauma, were often created centuries after the so-called traumatic events. I'll just give you one case in point. A case in point is the alleged trauma felt by Hindus because of the destruction of the Somnath temple by a Muslim invader, the Mahmud of Ghazni. More than 1,000 years ago, in 1026, after independence, a demand was made that a grand temple be constructed in Somnath. K. Munshi claimed in 1951, and I'm quoting him, you will see the contemporary relevance of this. Munshi says, for 1,000 years, Mahmud's destruction of the shrine has been burnt into the collective subconscious of the Hindu race as an unforgettable national disaster. So that this has been burnt into the psyche of the Indian, this humiliation or this destruction of the shrine. In fact, however, there was no evidence of a 1,000-year-old trauma. Munshi, unknowingly perhaps, was reflecting the colonial's perspective created in the 19th century, nearly 800 years later, because the earliest mention discovered so far of Hindu trauma caused by this Muslim invasion occurs in 1843 when it is brought up in the British House of Commons. Colonial historiography since the 19th century has used events like this to evolve a notion of permanent confrontation between the Hindus and Muslims, laying the basis of the two-nation theory. The communalists picked up this theme and amplified it. The eminent historian, Professor Romila Thapar, using a multiplicity of sources, has convincingly demonstrated that no such permanent confrontation between Hindus and Muslims occurred historically as a result of the destruction of the Somnath temple. She shows the following. 150 years after the destruction of the temple, a Hindu king rebuilt the Somnath temple without even a mention of Mahmud having destroyed it. More important, 250 years later, land was given to a Muslim trader to build a mosque on the land belonging to the same temple's estates, with the approval of the local Hindu ruler, local merchants, and priests. No sign of trauma. There is no sign of trauma in the collective memory of Hindus visible until it was a memory constructed much later under colonial patronage by their allies, the religious communal forces. Destruction of religious places was routinely done, and they were done across religions and sects, often to loot the wealth of those institutions or to establish authority in the ancient and medieval times, and was treated, it appears from Professor Thapar's account, as such. It didn't create any permanent trauma. Nehru himself had a much more nuanced account of Mahmud Ghazni than that portrayed by the colonial communal combine, where he sees him, I'm quoting Nehru, as far more a warrior than a man of faith, who used his army raised in India under a Hindu general named Tilak against his own co-religionists, Muslims, rulers in Central Asia. So the issue was not Hindu-Muslim, is what Nehru is emphasizing. The nationalist intelligentsia in the colonial period put forward a totally different interpretation of Indian history from the colonial communal one that I just mentioned, where they were not trying to create memories of historical trauma to create differences in the present. On the contrary, they drew on the reality of Indian society and how it organically dealt with religious, caste, and other differences through birth of new religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, or movements spanning many centuries like the Sufi and the Bhakti movements. Nehru perhaps best argues this position in his magisterial magnum opus, The Discovery of India. The lessons that Nehru tried to draw from Indian history were connected to his imagining India's future as a modern democratic country based on Enlightenment values, which we call the idea of India. He focused on a critical aspect of India's civilizational history, which is an openness to reason and rationality, a questioning mind and acceptance of multiple claims to truth, a dialogical tradition of being in conversation and discussion with each other, the ability to live with difference, accommodate, adjust, resolve, and transform rather than violently crush difference. It's interesting, as you all know, that decades later, this is a point that Amartya Sen has been making repeatedly in his two celebrated works, The Idea of Justice and The Argumentative Indian. This is exactly, or virtually in Nehru's words, he draws precisely these conclusions from our ancient past till today. Nehru draws from the Indus Valley civilization, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Gita, Buddha, Ashoka, Alauddin Khilji, Amir Khusro, Akbar, Vivekanand to Gandhi to illustrate the above, these processes I discussed. He emphasized also how the shared tradition in language, music, poetry, painting, architecture, philosophy, and everyday practice, cutting across religion and caste, contributed to the creation of a composite culture. While talking of songs composed by Amir Khusro, he said, I'm quoting, "I do not know if there is any other instance anywhere of songs written 600 years ago by Amir Khusro, which are sung till today in all exactly the same words, by people, by millions across the country, cutting across all religions." He talked of the emergence of the Indian civilization that occurred over the centuries through the absorption, assimilation, and synthesis of all the influences India was exposed to through trade, invasions, migration, intermixing. From the Indus Valley civilization 5,000 years ago to the Dravidian, I'm quoting him, Aryan, Central Asian, Iranian, Greek, Parthian, Bactrian, Scythian, Hun, Arab, Turk, early Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Afghan, and Mughal influences, all, as he says, leaving their mark, and in his beautiful language he says, like some ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer was completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. It is to this multiple religious languages, caste, etc., that it is as if Indian history ceased, that is stopped, to use a phrase used by the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral. Indian history ceased for virtually 200 years. Colonialism not only stopped the dynamic process of negotiating difference, but actually froze or even actuated these differences. And the communal forces were the chief instruments of accomplishing this task of accentuating these differences. The world has learnt at a very heavy cost, from Ireland, the oldest colony, to recent events in Palestine, about which Nehru has a lot to say, the role of imperialism in what is happening in Palestine today. The world has learnt from all this at the experiences of large parts of Asia and Africa, including India, that the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is not backwardness. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism has been that it left behind a divided people, as we are learning today. One method used by the colonial communal forces to create a religious divide, of which Nehru was very critical, was the colonial periodization of Indian history, which was done by James Mill in the early 19th century into three major periods: the ancient or Hindu, the Muslim, and the British period. Nehru is very critical of it as early as the 1930s. He says, it is unscientific to divide history like this. This division is neither intelligent nor correct. It is deceptive and gives a wrong perspective. It deals more with the superficial changes at the top than with the essential changes in the political, economic, and cultural development of the Indian people. He continues to say, it is wrong and misleading to talk of Muslim invasion of India or of the Muslim period in India, just as it would be wrong to refer to the coming of the British to India as a Christian invasion, or to call it by just the religion of the ruler, and emphasize the wider social and economic and cultural factors which defined a period, and also pointed out the continuities and the cultural intermixing of people belonging to different religious faiths. Later historians, almost every major historians that you know of in India, have confirmed Nehru's position on this, critiquing the colonial communal periodization of Indian history. I mention this only to say that he spearheaded this. Nehru was extremely critical of looking at history with the, I'm quoting, the old and completely out-of-date approach of a record of doings of kings and battles and such. He said, the whole conception of history of a country being the names of a large number of kings and emperors and our learning them by heart is long dead. I'm quite sure, unfortunately he was wrongly sure, whether in the schools and colleges of India it has ceased to exist or not. But I hope at any rate that it is dead, because anything more futile than children's study of the record of kings, regions and battles, I cannot imagine. On the contrary, Nehru anticipated what is now globally an accepted norm in cutting-edge historiography. He emphasized the social aspects of history. I'm quoting Nehru. He said, much closer research into the daily lives of the common man, maybe in family budgets, 100,000 ago, which makes us realize something of what the life of humanity was in the past age. As he put it in his characteristically beautiful prose, he says, it's only then that we really the dry bone with life, flesh and blood. Nehru was deeply aware of the various biases in history, in the writing of history, and very critical of the Europe-centric colonial which often overlapped and which unfortunately exercised influence, including in the former colonies till today. Giving the inaugural address to the Asian History Congress, Nehru said, the immediate object of History Congress should straighten out all the twists which Asian history has received at the hands of the Europeans. While some of them are very fine historians, their approach has nevertheless been based on Europe being the center of the world. He continued, in the case of India, a Westerner, especially from the United Kingdom, inevitably tended to look at the history of India as if the past few thousand years were a kind of a preparation for the coming British dominion in India. However, Nehru warned that as a reaction to that, sometimes our own historians have gone too far. There is a thing that is national at the expense of other things. As early as 1930s, reacting to the tendency to imagine a golden age in the past, which the communalists used to create a religious division, He said, everywhere are to be found people who consider their own country the best and regard it as sacred soil. They only study their ancient history and award it a high place. It becomes Satya Yuga or Ram Rajya, and the hope remains that the same may be restored. He argued both these approaches, the nationalist approach and the imperialist approach, distort history. They sometimes suppress history. Nehru showed in his own writings, particularly in the Glimpses of World History and also the Discovery of India, how one could be firmly anti-imperialist and also have pride in one's own history for the genuine achievements without resorting to blind, imaginary glorification of one's past, overlooking all the warts and blemishes. I'll have more to say of this at the end of my address. While on the subject of Eurocentric colonial positions, Nehru very early on refutes the tendency to obfuscate the difference between the empires of the ancient and the modern colonial empires emerging with the rise of capitalism. This is a tendency which has shockingly continued till today. He says, thank you, Nadeem sir. So kind of you. So kind of you. He says, as early as 1933, there have been vast empires for thousands of years, but modern imperialism is a new concept developed for the first time in recent years. But very few of us have understood its real import and often mistake it for imperialism of the old. Unless we understand this new imperialism properly and discern its roots and branches, we cannot grasp the conditions of the present day world and cannot properly wage our battle for freedom. This confusion between pre-modern empires and the colonial empires, as Nehru says, has continued till today. And all you have to do is read, for example, Frederick Cooper and Jane Burbank's work called Empire in World History to see that this is being argued globally, even till today, by many people. Throughout the pages of the voluminous Glimpses of History, World History, Nehru maintains and highlights the clear distinction and explains the very complex evolution of modern imperialism. Nehru repeatedly questions the colonial characterization picked up by the communalists of the medieval period when many of the rulers in India were Muslims from British colonial rule, which has been described as foreign rule. That Nehru was ramparts of the Red Fort. He reiterates the RSS position and talks of 1,000 years of foreign rule in India. You can see how important the distinction against foreign rule, that is the actual struggle against British imperialism, except to join them to fight the national movement. They now talk of freedom from a so-called Muslim rule in the medieval period. So the modern imperialism was not questioned, but a medieval foreign rule is what they are now trying to liberate India from. Nehru commented on this aspect, distinguishing the medieval period when many rulers were Muslim in India from the British period. And let me just quote him a bit on this. He says, the so-called Hindu ancient period is vast and full of change, of growth and decay, and then growth again. What is called the Muslim or medieval period brought in another change, and an important one, and yet it was more or less confined to the top and did not vitally affect the essential continuity of Indian life. The invaders who came to India from the northwest, like so many predecessors in more ancient, became absorbed into India and part of our life. Their dynasties became Indian dynasties, and there was a great deal of racial fusion by intermarriage. A deliberate effort was made, apart from a few exceptions, not to interfere with the ways and customs of the people. They looked to India as their home country and had no other affiliations. India continued to be an independent country. The coming of the British made a vital difference, and the old system was uprooted in many ways. They brought an entirely different impulse from the West, which had slowly developed in Europe and was taking shape in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The British remained outsiders, aliens, and misfits in India and made no attempt to be otherwise. Above all, for the first time in India's history, her political control was exercised from outside and her economy was centered in a distant place. He's using language that is used by Marxists even now, especially the world system analysts. They use exactly the language that Nehru is using in the 1930s. They made India a typical colony of the modern age, a subject country for the first time in her long history. A few more points, since I'm talking to distinguished historians, I'm going to focus. This is a very long address. I'll read only part 1 and 2. The rest I'll summarize in 3 minutes. Because the first part is Nehru and the discipline of history. I thought I'll just focus on that. That is what I was advised. And the other parts, Nehru's contribution to the making of modern India, you can read in my address. A few more points on Nehru and history writing, which are relevant today. From very early on, Nehru was a votary of looking at history in a global context. An exponent of what is now fashionably called connected histories. He said, the old idea of writing a history of any one country has become progressively out of date. It is impossible today to think of the history of a country isolated from the rest of the world. The world is getting integrated. We have to consider history today in a world perspective. Further, he said, it is quite impossible today to think of current events or of history in the making in terms of any one nation or country or patch of territory. You have inevitably to think of the world as a whole. As a man of action, one who contributed significantly to the making of modern India, Nehru saw the need to keep the big picture in mind while approaching history. Very wise words which our young students must pay attention to. He said, it has been given to us in the present age to play a part in the making of history. And for a person who does that, it becomes an even more important thing to understand the process of history so that he may not lose himself in trivial details and forget the main sweep. He urged historians not to get lost in the details so that they may see the wood a little more and not be lost in the individual tree. Any subject, he said, that you may investigate should be viewed in relation to a larger whole. Otherwise, it has no real meaning except as some odd incident which might interest you and your friends. Again, as a man of action, Nehru urged historians that they should not always write only for their brother historians, for the charmed circle of people who are in necessary conflict between real scholarship and a popular approach. Unless the masses understand our labor, he said, would be in vain, and books should be written keeping this in mind. Some of the tallest scholars in India, inspired by Nehru, by the Nehruvian dream, did try to do what he desired, writing school textbooks, popular pamphlets, and books which are understood popularly. From R.S. Sharma, Ramila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, Irfan Habib, D.N. Jha, Arjun Dev, Chiri Musui, Ranveer Chakravarti, Upinder Singh. I mean, I can go on. The tallest of the Indian scholars have kept what Nehru has said in mind, and that is why it is so difficult for the current forces to challenge and overthrow the historical worldview that has been created in India. Finally, a comment on how Nehru saw his role in taking the historical process forward. The lessons he learned from Indian history of the acceptance of the existence of multiple truths, of a non-violent dialogical tradition, of negotiating of truth claims and conflict, and arriving at a higher level of synthesis were greatly strengthened by his increasingly deeper understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and Gandhiji's practice. This involved, as seen in his autobiography, towards a more complex Gramscian Marxian understanding of how change was to be negotiated, which is reflected in his later writing, The Discovery of India. This shift in Nehru has been seen by many as Nehru's contradictory, vacillating nature, his total dependence and subservience to Gandhiji, his giving in to vested interests, and so on. We do not agree with that. In an insightful work, Manas Firak Bhattacharya sees Nehru's doubts, his ambivalence, his openness, his engagement with apparently contradictory positions, not as his weakness, but as his strength. He is correctly critical of people like Partha Chatterjee, who dismiss Nehru's absolutely outstanding work, The Discovery of India, as a book of rambling, bristling with the most obvious contradictions. Or other scholars, such as the Eurocentric Marxist Perry Anderson, who shockingly rubbishes Nehru's Discovery of India as a steam bath of Schwarmerei with a Barbara Cartland streak, if you can believe this. This is in his book, The Idea of India. The Indian Ideology. As Bhattacharya argues, the idea of liberty needs to be reconciled with the presence of contradictions. No idea or truth claim can justify the sacrifice of human lives. It would mean the barbarism of truth. Ethics provides us to think of freedom without violence. Nehru did not sit on a horseback with sword in one hand and rush towards the wilderness of history, thinking they were giants he had to exterminate. He did not hallucinate from the desire to rid the world of all its ills and create a gigantic prison in the name of paradise. This is where Nehru learned from Gandhiji. He accepted Gandhiji's position that however good the end, the means had to be ethical and non-violent. For Gandhiji, his deep conviction on non-violence did not emerge from the fact that it was a brilliant tactic to fight the British, which of course it was, but from his philosophical position that nobody could make the claim of having arrived at transcendental truth or absolute truth. His belief in the possibility of multiple truths and multiple paths to the seeking of truth would not allow for violence against anyone. Where the notions of possessing the ultimate truth justified mass killings by revolutionary movements in the name of democracy and the people, thus negating a critical aspect of democracy itself, that is, every human being's right to differ. Gandhiji saw this weakness in the French and the Russian Revolution as compared to the India struggle for freedom. Attention must be drawn here to Tad Fernie's work, where he compares the European Enlightenment project with the Indian, Turkish, and Iranian efforts at transition to modernity, with a focus on the Indian national movement under Gandhiji's leadership, with its what he calls the ethic of reconciliation as mass movement, as well as the Nehruvian effort after independence, which he calls the ethic of reconciliation in nation making. His conclusion is that the Indian experiment at transition to modernity without violence remained much truer to the Enlightenment objectives than what were achieved or tried to be achieved in Europe. Bhattacharya has done us a favor by quoting extensively from Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, thinker, diplomat, Nobel laureate, who was also the Mexican ambassador to India in Nehru's time, showing how he very sensitively comprehended what Nehru had discovered for himself from Indian tradition and Gandhiji, and how, very importantly, he brilliantly interpreted Nehru and his supposed contradiction. It is well worth repeating here repeating them here, if for no other reason but to show how great contemporaries of Nehru saw him in contrast to scholars whom I would characterize as Eurocentric, if not colonial, and of course, the communal fake nationalists in India. In a speech delivered in 1966, this is what Octavio Paz says. It is remarkable that Nehru, in spite of his mainly being a political leader, did not fall into the temptation of suppressing the contradictions of history by brute force or with a verbal sleight of hand. It is unique in our world of fanatical Menicians, that is, those who see things only in black and white, and hangmen masked as philosophers of history. He did not pretend to embody either the supreme good or the absolute truth, but human liberty, man and his contradictions. He was faithful to his contradiction, and for this very reason, he neither killed others nor mutilated himself. In contrast to the majority of the political leaders of this century, Octavio Paz says, Nehru did not believe that he had the key to history in his hand. Because of this, he did not stain his country nor the world with blood. Do remember that perhaps the Indian Revolution is the only revolution which was not followed by civil war. The entire period of transition from colonialism to post-colonial modernity occurs under the Nehruvian consensus. There is no mass killing of any kind from either side. Nehru tried to move forward towards his goal, what he thought was his historic role, with this sensibility. This meant following a path which could be slower, but it took people along and did not resort to violence and brute force, as many of his contemporaries trying the same transformation did in other parts of the world after being liberated from colonialism. We may ask ourselves the question that if Nehru was indeed as incompetent and evil as he's being described by certain forces, why the Mahatma chose him as his successor and not his other brilliant comrades like Raja Gopalachari and Sardar Patel. In a speech at the AICC on 15 June 1942, as early as that, Gandhiji said the following. Somebody suggested that Pandit Jawaharlal and I were estranged. This is baseless. Again, using imagery that only Gandhi could. He says, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is important to mention this because, as you know, these days, the effort is to constantly divide our national movement. Nehru versus Bose, Gandhi versus Patel, Patel versus Nehru, Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi. I mean, there is as if the national movement was only fighting each other rather than the British. So Gandhi says you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is just as difficult to divide us. I've always said that not Rajaji, not Sardar Vallabhbhai, but Jawahar will be my successor. When I am gone, he will speak my language too. Even if this does not happen, I would at least die with this faith. Why did Gandhi have such tremendous faith in Nehru? One can surmise only two reasons, and I will briefly mention that. First, Nehru quintessentially represented and fought for what Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And what was it? The idea of India, in brief, as I see it, is 5 core values. First, sovereignty, that is, India will be independent and self-reliant and oppose imperialist domination globally. 2, democracy, that is, India will be a democratic country with adult franchise, with equal rights to all citizens, irrespective of their caste, class, language, gender, region, or ethnicity. 3, secularism, that is, people belonging to different religious faiths will have equal rights in the country. India will not be a majoritarian Hindu state. Nehru and Gandhi repeatedly say that the future India is not going to be a Hindu Rashtra. Secularism and democracy were seen as coterminous. One could not exist without the other. The term secular democracy was often used conjointly, just as communalism was joined with loyalism. Secular democracy and communal loyalism. The fourth item in Idea of India was a pro-poor orientation. Beginning with the early nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, whose book was titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, to Gandhiji, turning the face of the country towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, to the revolutionaries, socialists and communists, all were agreed on a pro-poor orientation, even if there was no consensus on whether India was going to be socialist or a communist country. Lastly, the fifth idea was that India shall have a modern scientific outlook, which was to be propagated. Nehru called it the scientific temper, that is overcoming obscurantism and blind faith. It must be noted that there was a consensus among the entire spectrum of the Indian national movement on these five core values. That is why it is called the Idea of India. Entire national movement, from the moderates, Naoroji, Rana De, Gokhale, to Tilak, Siyadas, to Bhagat Singh, to Gandhiji, Nehru, Patel, Bose, Acharya Narendra Dev, the socialists, JP, communist, EMS, Kishan Singh Surjit, PC Joshi. Just think of any nationalist in this period. Across the spectrum, they agreed on these five core values. The only people who did not were the loyalists and the communalists, who now are masquerading as the nationalists. Not only did Nehru fight for these values during the freedom struggle, but he played a stellar role in implementing these ideas in the newborn state after independence. Gandhiji perhaps anticipated this capacity of Nehru in choosing him as his successor. In fact, the burden of implementing these ideas fell largely on Nehru's shoulders, with the Mahatma being murdered by a Hindu communalist within 6 months of India gaining independence, and Sardar Patel passing away in 1950. Nehru performed this task with great elan and imagination as India's first Prime Minister for about 17 years. It is on Nehru's role after independence in implementing the five core values of the Idea of India that my address is focused. It is necessary to do so because today, as we will see very briefly, each one of this Idea of India is deeply threatened. When we evaluate Nehru implementing the Idea of India after independence, we must remind ourselves of what economists call the initial conditions from which we had to start, to get an idea of the gigantic task ahead of him at independence. The poet Rabindranath Tagore, shortly before his death, had graphically anticipated the conditions of India at the end of British rule. This is what Tagore says. The wheels of fate will someday compel the English to give up the Indian Empire. What kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery! When the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last, what a waste of mud and filth will they leave behind them? The mud and filth left behind was a famine-ridden country. 3 million perished just 4 years before independence. It was a country where per capita income and food grain output was declining annually for 3 decades continuously before independence, where average life expectancy at independence was a shocking 30 years. People died on an average by the time they were 30. The poor died much earlier. On top of all this, the British left the country deeply divided on religious lines, with millions dead and rendered homeless in a communal carnage that occurred under colonial tutelage. It was a gigantic task indeed to lift India out of this misery, following the path laid down by the freedom fighters in their imagination of independent India. It is to Nehru's credit that he evolved a multi-pronged strategy to lift India out of this morass. which in fact became an example for numerous other countries which gained independence from colonial rule. I seek to outline in this address how Nehru undertook this stupendous and in many respects, historically, I emphasize, historically unique task of creating a modern democratic nation state in a plural society left deeply divided by the colonial state, of promoting modern industrialization within the parameters of democracy in a backward and colonially structured economy, of finding the balance between growth and equity in an impoverished, famine-ridden country, of empowering the people and yet expecting them to tighten their belt for the sake of the nation, of promoting the highest level of scientific education, a field left barren by the colonialists. In short, of unstructuring colonialism and bringing in rapid economic development, but doing it consensually, without the use of force, keeping what has been called the Nehruvian consensus intact in the critical formative years of the nation. A Herculean effort was needed to achieve this task, and Nehru rose to the occasion, putting everything he had in this effort. In the process, leaving behind a legacy not only for the Indian people, but for the peoples of the world oppressed by colonialism, who were striving to liberate themselves of their past, but in a humane and democratic manner. In the rest of the time I have, I will very briefly, I will not be reading out anything more, discuss what I do in the rest of the paper, and mention a few points on how he attempts to implement the various elements of the idea of India. Since the secular vision of idea of India was severely threatened at the birth of the independent Indian state itself, and is again today at the gravest risk with the rise of communalism, I begin in my next section, section 3, with the communal challenge. That is the longest section in my address. I show how the leaders of the Indian national movement, particularly Gandhiji and Nehru, dealt with the virtual Holocaust-like situation between 1946 and 48, which culminated with the murder of the Mahatma and the killings of lakhs of people and millions being made homeless. The leaders of the national movement, particularly Nehru and Gandhi, took on the communal challenge frontally and staked their lives to protect the minorities, in this case the Muslims, and thus democracy itself. They were not afraid of using the Muslim word, fearing that they will lose Hindu votes. They refused to allow India to become the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan, a Hindu Rashtra. In this section, I highlight, and this is what they did between the period 46 to 50. In this section, I highlight this aspect, what they did in this period and what we can learn from that, and some other lessons we can learn from Nehru, who had a deep understanding, probably the first to have a deep understanding of communalism in India. As early as the 1920s and 30s, he's writing about it, much before W.C. Smith and others in 1940s. First, just quick 5 points. First, Nehru emphasizes the need to oppose both minority and majority communalism. Lessons we can learn today, every political person can learn today. He warns that the response to one communalism cannot be the other communalism. As he put it, I'm quoting him, one communalism does not end the other. They feed on each other and they both fatten. Second, in relation to this, he says, in fact, these two communalisms, the minority and majority communalism, often cooperate with each other to keep the secular forces at bay. Witness the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha joining hands in their opposition to the Indian National Congress. Secularism is their main opposition. The other communalism is not actually their main opposition. They actually even formed governments together, as you know, the Muslim League and Hindu Mahasabha. Third, Nehru warned that while minority communalism tends to be separatist, majority communalism can
easily masquerade as nationalism, though in reality they are anti-national as it breaks the Indian nation. Now, this is very important that he's telling you in the 1930s that majority communalism can easily masquerade as nationalism. As he puts it, Hindu nationalism is just another name for communalism. It is in reality anti-national and reactionary. During the national movement days, the word Hindu nationalism was not used. They were called communalists. It's a great pity that from journalists to academics, people have now started using the word that the Hindu communalists used for themselves. That is Hindu nationalist. How can you call anybody? It's a misnomer. It's a contradiction in terms. In a multi-religious country, if you're Hindu nationalist, you break the nation. You're anti-national. Fourth, Nehru was the first to warn of the fascist nature of communalism. Just as Amartya Sen in 1993 was the first to use the term communal fascism for the fascist forces in India. He repeatedly warned of the fascist nature of the Muslim League and the RSS. I'm quoting Nehru. He says, communalism is in fact the Indian version of fascism. And by following this path, he says, the ultimate result would be similar to what happened to Hitler and fascism in Europe. I do not want India to follow this terrible path. Wise words which we need to heed today. Fifth, Nehru emphasized that both the use of state power and an ideological battle is necessary to combat communalism. After banning the RSS and putting 20,000 RSS workers in jail following Gandhiji's murder, and after giving a complete drubbing to the communal parties in the first general election of India in 1951-52, all the communal parties put together could not get more than 10 seats. After doing that, Nehru has the following to say. He gives the following warning, which we must: winning an election, banning communal organizations, arresting arresting those who promote violence are important steps, but they are not enough. He said, the communal poison has permeated the land, and we have to uproot this despicable communalism. It must be obliterated from this land so that it may not take roots again. To achieve this, Nehru says, the superior force of the state is necessary, but it is not enough. Because, as he said, those who are impelled by a faith in a cause, in other words, the bhakts, can seldom be crushed by superior force. They can only be defeated by a higher idealism. Very wise words. The higher idealism that he offered to communalism was a secular, humane, inclusive, pro-poor nationalism. In other words, not to abandon the nationalist platform to the communalists, but to appropriate it at a higher idealistic level. While waging this ideological battle, Nehru, the great believer in civil liberties and the freedom of the press, nevertheless argued that communal propaganda, spreading hatred through lies, humors, creating enmity, should not be tolerated and must be suppressed with a heavy hand. He, in fact, in 1956, proposed a law that the media, which meant the press at that time, which spread hatred, I'm quoting him, and even made money out of it. You can see the resemblance to the TRP ratings that people talk about today, should be dealt with strictly and punished. You can see much can be learned from Nehru as you watch how the hate media flourishes today with state patronage. In section 4, I discuss Nehru's critical role in building and nurturing the institutions of democracy. A functioning parliament with respect for the opposition, not notion of opposition mukt parliament, an independent judiciary, less said the better, independent bureaucracy, a non-political armed forces, a free press, and above all, for Nehru, an independent education system. What Nehru had to say about universities has already been quoted. Each one of these is under threat today. Each one of these institutions of democracy that I've talked in this section are under threat today. In the next section, section 5, I discuss how Nehru makes, and I underline, the historically unique effort at economic transformation with democracy and sovereignty. No country in the world made the transition to industrialism with democracy. I show how, in a very brief period, he was able to unstructure the colonial structure with massive progress in industry and agriculture. I also discuss how he anticipated the knowledge revolution nearly by half a century and made huge progress in the areas of science and technology, enabling India to participate at whatever low level in this global information and knowledge revolution. The Nehru model became an example, as I said, to other post-colonial countries trying to develop in a humane, democratic manner. In section 6, I discuss how Nehru succeeds in keeping his gaze focused on the poor, the oppressed and disadvantaged. Never have the poor been abandoned as they are in India today. And that is what I have tried to talk about in this section. Constitution of India, in Article 51A, laying down is this notion of the scientific temper is being created. Nehru said, the scientific temper, I'm quoting, points out the way along which you should travel. It is the scientific approach, the adventurous and yet critical temper of science, the search for truth and new knowledge, the refusal to accept anything without testing and trial, the capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of evidence, the reliance on the observed fact and not preconceived theory, the hard discipline of the mind. All this is necessary, not merely for the application of science, but for life itself and solution of its many problems. It is in this spirit that the quotation that was given about what a university stands for, that Nehru said, that it stands for humanism, tolerance, for reason, for the adventure of ideas and the search for truth. But in that paragraph, he adds one thing which was not read out, which I shall read out to you. He says, but if the temple of learning itself becomes a home of narrow bigotry and petty objectives, how then will a nation prosper or a people grow in stature? Since all of us are involved in the university system and we are witnessing the effort to destroy it, from JNU to Delhi University to UGC to just name every institution to the ICHR, these are words of Nehru that we must remember very, very much. What a contrast are we witnessing today? The university system I talked about. The Guardian quotes the current Prime Minister mixing up mythology about gods and goddesses with history and science while inaugurating a new hospital in Bombay. We can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical sciences at one point of time, the Prime Minister told a gathering of doctors and professionals. We all read about Karna in the Mahabharata. If we think a little more, we realize that the Mahabharata says Karna was not born from his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. That is why Karna could be born outside his mother's womb. We worship Lord Ganesha. There must have been some plastic surgeon at that time who got an elephant's head on the body of a human being and began the practice of plastic surgery. This is your Prime Minister. The Hindustan Times reported the governor of Bengal doing violence to both science and history, who said, while addressing peculiarly, paradoxically, addressing a science and engineering fair in Kolkata, he said that the mythological character Arjuna, his arrow had nuclear power, and chariots mentioned in the Mahabharata actually flew. He, as you know, has since been promoted to become the Vice President of India. No wonder in our country today we fight Corona with state patronage, with Gobar, Gomutra, Thali, banging of thalis, Tali, shining torchlights, shining your mobile torchlights, Ganga Snan, and unverified medicines were yogi. I mean, this is not a laughing matter that a country with such a long tradition of civilizational values of scientific progress should be doing this. In sum, therefore, it is as if the political leaders have reversed their roles from that of pulling up society and bringing it in line with the highest global civilizational values, a role performed by the leaders of the Indian national movement like Gandhi and Nehru, to that of pushing society back by appealing to sectarian identities, acquisitive instincts, and traditional prejudices. The hegemonic idea of India, the common sense of the Indian people, created by the Indian national movement, is today severely challenged. And that challenge is not coming from a backward traditional people. Do understand, this challenge is not coming from our people. It is from the leaders and the state machinery. Nehru's fantastic effort to raise India from what Tagore called the mud and filth left behind by the British has now been replaced with the Indian people being pushed back into that same mud and filth of ignorance, obscurantism, disempowerment, unfreedom, and above all, communal hatred. Thank you.
Professor Aditya Mukherjee, it was really very enlightening and refreshing to hear your long address. Ladies and gentlemen, now we proceed to something for which many of us have been waiting for, and that is the awards ceremony. The Indian History Congress has a number of awards. There are 7 awards which are given for books and 10 awards which are given on papers. Generally, the awards which are given on books are naturally generally to the senior historians, not necessarily senior, but most of them senior scholars, while the awards on the papers, the prizes on the papers are generally reserved for the youngsters. Let us start with the book awards which we have, and one of the very prestigious awards which is given by Indian History Congress is the H.K. Badpujari National Award, which carries along with a plaque and a certificate an amount of rupees 50,000. And this year, Mr. Salim, can you come up with the awards? Yeah. The Badpujari Award this year is being bestowed upon Professor Krishna Mohan Shrimali for his published by Akad. This has been published in 2022. I call upon Professor Shrimali to come and receive the award. Salim, laiye. Vice Chancellor, sir. I request the Vice Chancellor to give the award to Professor K.M. Shrimali. Congratulations, Professor Shrimali, once again. Now, this is the first year when another award instituted by one of our members, Professor Annapurna Chattopadhyay Award for the best book published in ancient India from a regional perspective. Professor Annapurna herself, who has given the announcement, could not come up to be present here because at the moment she is not well. But the Annapurna Chattopadhyay Award for this year, for the first time, is being given to Professor Aloka Parashar Sen for Gender, Religion and Local History, the Early Deccan, published by Primus Books in 2023. Professor Parashar. I would request Professor Aditya Mukherjee to hand over the award to Professor Parashar. Welcome, ma'am. Then we have another award, Professor Muhammad Habib Memorial Prize for the best book on medieval Indian history. That is being given to one of our members, late Dr. Zakir Hussain Sahab. Dr. Zakir Hussain Sahab was in the National Archives and was an expert of Shikaste Persian, and he was the only one who could decipher all type of documents, and he was always ready to help any youngster or any scholar who would visit National Archives, and he would try to help the scholar in deciphering the primary documents which are in Persian language. Unfortunately, a year back, he died, and with his death, there is now a paucity of people who can actually read that script in which our old sources were written. So this prize would be sent to his family, but I would request Professor Zahir Jafri Saab, Professor Zahir Jafri, to come on the stage and take the award on behalf of Dr. Zakir Hussain. I would request the Vice Chancellor once again to give over the prize. Vice Chancellor. Savitri Chandra Shobha Memorial Award for a book on history of Indian literature and culture. This award goes to a young scholar, Dr. Epsita Haldar, who has written a book, Reclaiming Karbala, Nation, Islam and Literature of Bengali Muslims, published by Routledge in 2023. Epsita Haldar, please come on the stage. And for a best book on modern Indian history. This award goes to Professor K.L. Tuteja for his book Religion, Community and Nation, Hindu Consciousness and Nationalism in Colonial Punjab, published by Primus in 2021. Professor Tuteja, the award would be given by Professor Abdullah Mukherjee. You're very nice. Professor Hira Lal Gupta Research Award for a best book by a woman. This goes to Professor Ashika Chakravarti for her book Widows of Colonial Bengal, Gender, Morality and Cultural Representation, once again published by in 2023. Ashika ji, the Vice Chancellor. And the last of the book prizes is Braj Dev Prasad Memorial Prize for the best book on ancient Indian history. This goes to Dr. Snigdha Singh for her book Inscribing Identities, Proclaiming Piety, Exploring Practices in Early Historic India. And I would request Professor Feluthat to hand over this. Now we have 10 prizes for the articles which were presented in the last session. The first of them, Professor Vijay Kumar Thakur Memorial Prize for the best paper in section 1, that is Ancient India, goes to a PhD scholar, Ujjwala Yadav, for her paper, The City and the Conquest for Wealth in the Jatakas, circa 5th century BC to 5th century CE. Professor Aditya Mukherjee would be giving the award. Professor J.S. Grewal Prize for the best paper in section 2, that is Medieval India, goes to another PhD scholar, Khushbu Rashid from Jamia Millia Islamia. Her paper is Syphilis in Mughal India and its role in shaping medical thought and practice. As she is herself not present, she writes to me that Mr. Shitij would collect the award on her behalf. Mr. Shitij, are you there? Professor Aditya Mukherjee would give the award. The next award is Professor Partha Sarthi Gupta Memorial Prize and Professor J.C. Jha Memorial Prize, both together, for the best paper in section 3rd. So there are two recipients. One is Deepanita Datta, who gets the Partha Sarthi Award for her paper Mechanics, Melody and Mathematics. And the second one is Arka Chowdhury, another PhD scholar from Jadavpur. I also request her to come. Her paper is Imperial Racial Discourse and Military Technology, the British Indian Army's warfare in Afghanistan. On her behalf, Mr. Sanmitra Ghosh, representative of Primus, would be there to collect the award. Professor Aditya Mukherjee, please. Professor Sudhir Ranjan Das Memorial Prize for the best paper in archaeology section, section 5, goes to a PhD scholar from Santiniketan, Vishwa Bharati Santiniketan, Ruma Mukherjee. Her title is